Good afternoon. I believe we are live. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the side event organized by Knowledge Ecology International, Health Action International, and Medicines Law and Policy. It's a side event to the World Health Assembly that will start next week in Geneva. It's wonderful to be here together again. We did a similar event last year, and like last year, I'll start by saying how much we regret not being able to meet with all of you in person in Geneva. But I should also mention that the upside of moving these events into the world of Zoom and YouTube is, of course, that many more people can take part. We have several hundreds that have registered, and the event is streaming on YouTube. As some of you may remember, the theme of last year's side event was around the COVID-19 technology access pool, which we discussed with a great deal of optimism, I believe, when we saw vaccines coming out of the pipeline, massive public financing having made that possible, and a rather modest request to those that hold the intellectual property and know how to share that to enable scale up of manufacturing. There was a real concern a year ago that the vaccines that were being developed would not be available at a large enough scale to supply to everyone in need, which is in this case the entire planet. I think a year on, we can say that concern was indeed justified, but unfortunately, the COVID-19 technology access pool remains empty, and we see a lot of discussions and a lot of conflict breaking out around the issues of intellectual property and the sharing of know-how, as we are also familiar with, of course, in other disease areas. So this event, with this event, we want to focus a little bit on the future, because if there's one lesson that we've learned over the last year, is that the world was not prepared. Perhaps some of us thought we were, that there was some master plan somewhere, but clearly there was not. And I think it is fair to say that the world needs new rules. Now, the topic of the pandemic treaty will be on the agenda of the World Health Assembly that kicks off next week. And we want to use this side event to throw out some ideas about what such a treaty should say about the sharing of intellectual property, knowledge and know-how for the public good. The other issue, and it is of course somewhat related, that the World Health Assembly will discuss, are the recommendations of the independent panel on pandemic preparedness response. And we are very, very pleased that the Right Honorable Helen Clark, who was one of the co-chairs of this panel, has agreed to open this event with a keynote, which she has pre-recorded because she could not be here in person. So I would like to introduce this video and ask the Health Action International technical staff to start the recording.
Thank you for inviting me to address this important side event today. I would particularly like to thank Health Action International and today's moderator, Ellen Terhuen, for bringing us together. It was in May last year that the World Health Assembly asked the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, to initiate an impartial, independent, and comprehensive review of the international health response to COVID-19. Dr. Tedros then asked former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia and me to convene an independent panel which would report to the World Health Assembly this year. As President Sirleaf and I have said, when the panel's main report was launched last week, the panel identified gaps and failures at every step of pandemic preparedness and response. Among our findings was the conclusion that the main legal instrument designed to guide the world on preparedness and response, the international health regulations, has hindered rather than helped the WHO in its ability to respond to the current crisis. And we do believe that more robust legal instruments are needed. We've described the COVID-19 pandemic as being to global health what Chernobyl was to nuclear safety. These events are so devastating that they can serve as catalysts for far-reaching change. It was exactly 5 months after the Chernobyl nuclear accident that 2 new treaties pertaining to nuclear safety were agreed on early notification and on assistance in the event of a nuclear accident. Therefore, we conclude where there is the will and a sense of urgency, it's possible for states to agree a global treaty in the space just a few months. The panel supports such urgency being given to the negotiation of a pandemic framework convention now. We suggest that it should address gaps in the international legal framework and clarify responsibilities of states and international organizations. It could conceivably also set out principles for mechanisms on financing, research and development, knowledge and technology transfer, and capacity building. As vaccines become increasingly available in high-income countries, the prospect of a 2-tier recovery from the pandemic is looking depressingly likely. With the higher income countries knocking back the pandemic with the help of comprehensive vaccination, and low and middle income countries facing a persistent pandemic of neglect. Extraordinary times need extraordinary measures. To head off such a 2-tier world, our panel made a number of urgent recommendations on vaccines. We're all aware that the high-income countries collectively have on order far more vaccine doses than they would ever need to cover their populations. So as they're scaling up their vaccination rollouts, we call on them to provide by September at least 1 billion doses to the 92 low and middle income countries covered by the Gavi COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, and 2 billion doses in total by the middle of next year. That redistribution would help cover the highest priority groups in low and middle income countries. But then the challenge to more equitable vaccine rollout is not just one of distribution. There is also a major challenge of supply. There has just not been a rapid enough scale up of production of vaccines to meet the urgent need for comprehensive global vaccination. And that is why the panel has called on the WHO and the WTO to convene urgently a meeting of the major vaccine manufacturing countries and companies to crunch through an agreement on greatly expanded voluntary licensing and knowledge and technology transfer agreements for COVID-19 vaccines. We say, if that can't be achieved within 3 months, then a waiver of intellectual property rights under the TRIPS agreement should come into force immediately. The recent United States announcement of being prepared to enter into negotiations around a TRIPS waiver is very welcome. But of course, reaching consensus on a waiver, necessary and important as it is, could take time. Therefore, a brokered agreement on rapid scale-up of manufacturing via voluntary licensing and knowledge and technology transfer would play a vital role right now. The current high-income country-dominated market-based model for the development and supply of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines ultimately doesn't serve our world well. We need both pandemic preparedness and its tools to respond to pandemics, including vaccines, to be supported for what they are, global public goods. We note that the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, CTAP, established at WHO, has received no contributions so far. Our panel therefore proposed that a robust, pre-negotiated global platform should be created to stand in readiness for future disease outbreak responses, and that it should be capable of creating rapid end-to-end solutions for essential supplies. It could be built upon the successes of Act A, the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, and we can learn from where Act A has been most challenged as we redesign a standing platform in this area. That platform should be able to coordinate decision-making globally and maintain effective relationships with vaccine and other product manufacturers in the public and private sectors. It should help strengthen global and local manufacturing capacity and enable long-term and sustained investment in technology transfer. We can no longer afford to rely solely on a model of charitable giving, which proves inadequate in the face of global infectious threats. Alongside the panel's main report, we have published a number of detailed background papers, and these include those on models for international treaties and on the legal aspects of scaling up access to vaccines. I would really recommend that you take the time to look at these on our website, as they go into these topics in far more detail than I can today. Strong voices from civil society will be critical in driving reform in pandemic preparedness and response, and in holding governments and international organizations to account. We need transformational change which is capable of ensuring that this current pandemic really will be the very last one to cause devastation on the scale we are witnessing today. Thank you.
That was a very clear, very powerful message from Helen Clark. I think an excellent introduction to our panel. We need transformational change. What will that look like? I echo her recommendation to read the reports and the background documents, because there is an enormous amount of material in there. But it is clear that we need ambitious political action to make that happen. Global public good, as we've seen in the last year, will not happen automatically. We have an absolute wonderful panel that will discuss these issues further. I will quickly list them because you may not have the program in front of you. We have the next speaker, as soon as she comes on, because I just got a message that Ms. Winnie Bienyama from UNAIDS may be a little late, but she's the next, if not, she will be the next speaker. If she is a little later, then she will be followed by Catalina de Vanda. She is the ambassador of Costa Rica and permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations. Dr. Anban Pillay, Deputy Director for Health of South Africa. We have Dr. Philippe Duneton, who is the Executive Director of UNAIDS, who will join us at around 2:30, and Dr. Martin Friede, who coordinates the Initiative for Vaccine Research, Immunization, Vaccines and Biologics at the World Health Organization. The speakers will be followed by respondents, Luis Villar-Roel from Chile, James Love, Knowledge Ecology International, Jeremy Vidal from Health Action International, Anna Marriott from Oxfam, and then we will open for Q&A. The Q&A is open. You can post your questions and comments there, and we'll try to respond to them after the speakers have had their say. I don't believe that Winnie has arrived yet. in that case, I would like to invite Catalina de Vandas to take the floor and to share her thoughts with us. I should mention that Costa Rica has played a very important role in the establishment of the COVID-19 technology access pool. The calls for that pool to become operational and become effective are actually getting louder and louder by the day, as we also just heard Helen Clark say. Over to you, Catalina. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Helen, and thanks for the organizers, and greetings to the panelists in this important event. We are convened here to discuss on what is the content of a treaty, a potential treaty of WHO on preparedness and response for pandemics. As we speak, this is still being discussed. We are in the middle of the negotiations to try to find consensus on moving forward. It seems a little bit surprising, and with something that is so urgent. Costa Rica is, of course, fully supportive of this idea, understanding and hearing the recommendations and findings of the IPPPR, the IHR committee, the IOAC, that give us a very clear picture, of the inadequacy of our current tools, our response. And of course, as was highlighted by Dr. Helen Clark, the evidence of the inequities on the distribution of vaccines, with a picture that we anticipated, although we didn't want to see, a picture in which 5 countries have received more than half of the doses that are available, and where low-income countries have received only 0.3% of the availability of the doses, available. So we are in a situation, I don't need to repeat that is very dramatic, a situation that is against all the epidemiological advice. We understand and we all know that we won't be safe until everybody is safe, yet we're failing to do or to take the basic measures at international level to combat this pandemic in a way that will be sustainable and that will protect those that are in the most vulnerable situations. So, and this has been already said, and I know that you're very familiar with that. We've mentioned the COVID Technology Access Pool as an initiative that Costa Rica has led over almost a year. It's going to be a year at the end of May. It's heartbreaking to see that despite knowing what was needed and despite trying to anticipate some of those challenges, we were unable to take action on that. And I think the treaty is giving us the opportunity and the lessons learned that we have, of course, gathered during the last year is giving this opportunity for us to seriously, as an international community, commit to engage in a discussion on what are we going to do, in which ways are we going to start discussing about the sharing of knowledge, of innovation, of intellectual property, the sharing of those tools that we need to detect, to prevent, and to respond to any infection diseases now and in the future, thinking about future pandemics already. We need to discuss about what are the protections that we want as an international community to provide to that knowledge, to that international property. How do we want to consider this as a public good, and how to find the balance to achieve just and equitable responses to health and to humanitarian crisis as the one that we are seeing. So how do we engage in a conversation about open licenses, about non-exclusive voluntary licenses? How do we engage in a conversation about research and development agreements and conditionalities to those agreements? If we are investing public money, shouldn't we expect something on return? Do we need to put some foundations in the treaty to make sure that this happens across the board, and that we know that the knowledge, the findings, the result of that research will be widely used and the benefit of all. We need, of course, to discuss the transfer of technology and the capacity, how to increase the local capacity, how to avoid the bottlenecks that we are witnessing when it comes to production. And this is, of course, a conversation that is not easy. It has been mentioned, of course, the whole discussion that we need to have together with WTO, the discussions on trade, the discussion on the waiver, that it's going to take long, as Mrs. Clark said. But I think that and with that I end, we have an opportunity with the treaty to start digging into these issues and to create some foundations, hopefully some long-standing principles that then will inform the conversation for any conversation on trade and for any conversation on a future pandemic. We need to have this conversation. One thing which I think it's important to highlight is, despite the fact that the CTAP hasn't been able to put any single license until now, the conversation is now somehow resuscitated due to the conversation, the open conversation on the waiver, but also due to the lessons that we are learning. So we are hearing that new states are joining. We will have an event to relaunch the initiative at the end of the month. And we hope that this will continue to be an opportunity, together with the other initiatives, such as the manufacturer task force that the WHO is also promoting to increase local capacity, that together with that tool, we can use the CTAP as the platform that is needed to move forward and to try to provide responses to the current challenges. So I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the interaction and the conversation in the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. And we know that there are many delegations to the World Health Assembly participating in this side event, and I hope they heard your message loud and clear, that it is time to build those foundations. Also, your message about the need for conditionalities and the need for continued financing for research and development, but not without such strings attached, is very important, and encouraging that there are plans to relaunch the CTAP later this month with increased participants. I do not know whether Ms. Bienyama has joined. I believe that is not the case. If she is indeed not here yet, then I would like to invite Dr. Anban Pillay to make his remarks. He is the Deputy Director General for Health in South Africa. Anban, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Pity that we can't see you in person, but we would meet virtually, international and Kai as well. These outbreak of COVID remind us a lot of what we experienced outbreak of HIV and the consequent access to ARVs and the global challenges that we had around IP linked to ARVs. And I think what we're seeing in the case of vaccine is dissimilar in terms of that. I've noted that the access to vaccines is currently disproportionately aligned, and I think the Director General of WHO has made a strong case for that, and I think we need to make every effort to try and realign the distribution of vaccines so that is South Africa is a co-chair to the ACT, and we have certainly tried our best to to influence the decision making through that process and bring on board as many vaccines as we could, as well as the technology that would be required in order for us to tackle this pandemic.
Anban, we had difficulty hearing you. I think we have lost connection with Anban Pillay. We'll wait for him to come back. While we do that, perhaps I should turn to Philippe, the next speaker, who is Philippe Duneton, the Executive Director of Unitaid, who has joined the panel. Philippe, are you ready to offer your remarks? Philippe, we don't hear you, nor see you. We now see you. Welcome, Philippe. We've moved you up a little bit in the program because we had connection trouble with the previous speaker. So if you are ready, I'll be happy to give you the floor. Welcome to this event, and we would like to hear your remarks on what you think a pandemic treaty could offer in terms of unlocking the situation that we have today around intellectual property and knowledge sharing. Philippe, the floor is yours.
I'm afraid your microphone isn't working, Philippe. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you should see a microphone, and there's a small arrow next to it. And if you select that, hopefully you can see where we'll be able to hear you.
I'm there now.
I do see that Winnie has joined us. Welcome, Winnie. Wonderful to see you. We have a couple of technical issues that we're trying to sort out. Philippe, maybe I should just leave you alone to sort out your microphone. And then I believe Winnie is ready to offer her remarks. If that is indeed the case, then I would like to invite Winnie Bienyama to give her presentation. She is the Executive Director of UNAIDS and a very vocal advocate for access to vaccines and a proponent of the people's vaccine movement. Winnie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, I'm delighted to join you today for this very important discussion. Can you hear me? Good. I'd like to thank the organizers, Knowledge Ecology International, Medicines, Law and Policy, and Health Action International. I also want to congratulate Prime Minister Helen Clark and President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for the excellent report of the Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. UNAIDS welcomes that important report and hopes that its recommendations will be reflected in the final text of the pandemic treaty. It's our duty, as the report states, to make COVID-19 the last pandemic, a health emergency anywhere in the world should never and never has to become a global pandemic. Yet, at the moment, we are far off course to achieve just that. COVID-19 related deaths are increasingly concentrated in low and middle income countries. The scenes from Brazil and India are heartbreaking, witnessed by the whole world. What's happening before our eyes is driven by what President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa called vaccine apartheid. The scale of this inequality is not an accident. Let's be clear. It was predictable months ago. We commend the scientific developments that led to effective COVID-19 vaccines in such a short time, with governments investing over $100 billion on their development. We also welcome news of vaccine donations, such as the recent generous one from the United States. But these can only plug small, immediate need. Sadly, the power to decide how many vaccines are made, who they are sold to, and at what price has been left to private companies. Let me share two examples to highlight the stark inequality. Pfizer committed months ago to give 40 million doses to COVAX, the facility to help developing countries vaccinate. But to date, they have delivered just 1.25 million doses, less than 1 day's production for them. Meanwhile, at least 9 people have become new billionaires since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, thanks to the excessive profits pharma companies with monopolies on the COVID vaccines are making. Their total wealth could vaccinate every single person in the world's poorest countries if governments committed to protecting people rather than protecting billionaire profits. A year ago, the barrier to battling this cruel disease was science. We were racing for scientific discovery. Today, the barrier is inequality, and that's political. The People's Vaccine Alliance calls for 3 urgent actions. First, technologies need to be openly shared with every competent manufacturer in the world. I honestly, respectfully disagree with those who argue against the sharing of the vaccine know-how with developing countries. We mustn't fall into the trap of assuming that all global skills and expertise in this area are locked up in a handful of rich nations. That's not true. We had to challenge these mindsets to ensure people have access to life-saving HIV treatments. That's more than 25 years ago. We must do it again now. The WHO COVID-19 Technology Access Pool is a mechanism to facilitate such sharing, and it is the only way to immediately ensure production of vaccines and other COVID-19 tools where they are most needed. We must get governments to line up behind it. Secondly, world leaders, especially the G7 and the European Union, must follow President Biden's leadership and support the proposal by India and South Africa at the WTO to waive intellectual property rules on COVID-19 tools, including vaccines and treatments. The TRIPS waiver would allow the removal of artificial barriers that are impeding developing countries to access life-saving medicines. I was encouraged that this week a resolution was adopted by the European Parliament in favor of the TRIPS waiver. Let's see their governments come behind that. And finally, while the above is vital to scale up, secure supply of vaccines and drive vaccine prices down to sustainable levels, affordable levels, these actions must go hand in hand with a clear financing plan, with burden sharing according to GDP of countries to vaccinate the whole world. Nobody will get out of this until we all get out of it. Many lives have been lost. We mustn't choose a different path based on, we must now choose a different path based on public health, not private wealth. A people's vaccine and an effective pandemic treaty that includes the recommendations of the IPPPR report are crucial to end COVID-19 and ensure that it is the last pandemic we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winnie, for these very powerful words and some very good demands and suggestions for what needs to be taken up by governments. Everyone so far has talking about the need for the sharing of the technology. Also, indeed, important to draw attention to affordable pricing, because that will certainly over time become a huge challenge. I believe that Mr. Anban Pillay has rejoined. Anban, could I give you the floor? And if there are problems with the transmission, may I suggest you turn off the video, because it may be a bandwidth issue and that you may be helped with that. Of course, we would rather see you and hear you, but if it is a choice between the two of them, let's make sure we get your voice. Anban, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Yes, I think maybe the bandwidth gave me trouble. Apologies for that. If I can just reiterate the point I made earlier, which was I think the role that WHO and colleagues are going to play in making sure that there's access to vaccines and technologies for diagnostics in COVID are critical. And these experiences remind us a lot of the challenges that we had in the IP debates and challenges around ARVs that bedeviled us for many years. We're co-chair to ACT-A, and we certainly try to do our best to persuade our fellow countrymen to support the access issues that challenge us in terms of vaccines as well as diagnostics. So I do want to emphasize the point that in addition to vaccines, there are a number of challenges that many countries face relating to diagnostics as well as therapeutics. And we should not forget that as we place a lot of focus around the access to vaccines. I think the issues of production around vaccines are twofold. There are the full and finish type facilities as well as the API type facilities. And I think very often these are conflated to suggest that low and middle income countries don't have production capacity. And I think specifically one is talking more about the API side of things rather than the full and finish. There are a number of facilities on the African continent that can certainly do full and finish. And I think with some support, the API side can certainly also be assisted. I do want to make the point as well that while there's been a number of sites that have been initiated, for example, in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine globally for the production of the vaccine, there is also this practice of what we call market segmentation, where particular manufacturers are restricted to sell the product in a particular market. And when there are shortages or limitations in supply from that particular site, it's very difficult for countries to then access the product from other potential producers. We've also faced the challenge during access to vaccines of transparency. All of the contractual agreements that we have faced come with a non-disclosure agreement clause that doesn't allow countries to openly share with its citizens the details of the procurement, the pricing, the conditions of access, etc., which are fairly onerous. Some of them go to the point of saying, well, if you don't have access to the vaccine, you have, after signing the contract and paying, there's not very much you could do about it if the company fails to actually share the doses with you. I think the issues of voluntary licensing are important in this context. We've had many lessons around this in the context of ARVs, and also now in the case of TB and other diseases. And I think certainly we could take advantage of those learnings to see how we can accelerate the access to vaccines using this mechanism. And I think finally, just to echo the words of the director of UNAIDS, is there is certainly an opportunity to stimulate local production on the African continent and in other countries across the world, particularly the low and middle income, in sharing of knowledge so that local production can be an effective mechanism where countries can access these products rather than having to always be dependent on a few producers in order to produce global volumes. Thank you very much, Chair, for listening to me.
Thank you, Anban. A couple of very important points you make there about the production capacity, and as some of the other speakers also pointed out, there is production capacity currently not being used, and the fact that support may be needed, of course, also speaks again to the need for a functioning CTAP and other types of support towards the technology transfer. Also, happy you mentioned the theme of transparency. That would clearly have to be a theme that will also be addressed when treaty negotiations starts. I would expect. The next speaker on our program is Philippe Duneton from Unitaid. Philippe, may I ask you to take the floor? Welcome to this World Health Assembly side event. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hélène, and sorry for the technical issue. So I think a lot has been said, and I would just reinforce what Hélène Clark was saying, and also Winnie. I think the situation we are is not good at all in terms of access. It's not where we should be, in particular for access to vaccine or other drugs, by the way, especially in Africa. There are basic drugs like access to oxygen and corticoid, for example, that it's not there, and it has a dramatic effect in the mortality. So again, I think that a lot have been said, and I don't want to repeat it, but clearly the situation of access is something that needs to be addressed. A couple of remarks I want to make is that, and also thinking about the treaty, we need to find solution for this crisis now. But we need to be a little bit more specific, I think, now and also for the future of the treaty, and recognize that first, we need to have all the tools. It's about access to vaccines, it's about access to treatment, it's about access to diagnostic. So there is not only one tool that needs to be considered. And I'm saying that because I fully respect the need to really push access to vaccines by all means, but also we need to prepare for potentially new drugs, I hope, that we will see coming in the coming weeks and months. So don't want to go into all the details, but I think that we need to recognize that vaccine production is more than a process, than a product. And of course, we need to make sure that the barriers in terms of IP need to be addressed when needed. But of course, it was mentioned, but it's a question of access to technology, access to know-how, quality assurance, and of course, training of people. So this piece has to be considered together if we want to make a difference, including of course, local production or regional production that needs to start to be considered now. And as you know, UNITED is very supportive of course, the platform that WHO is developing, in particular for RNA vaccine, but also how this can be articulated with voluntary license with the support of the medicine patent pool, for example. We have a lot of experience with them. Amban mentioned that in terms of IRVs, there are things that we can learn and we need to expand, but to go fast. So this is one point I want to stress. The other point is that in terms of medicines, we know the situation, and currently we know that potentially new drugs can potentially be have to be considered. And we know also, because we are talking to industry, in particular generic manufacturers, that in fact they are even more ahead in terms of clinical development for this drug. What we need is really an issue in terms of IP, is to make sure that the scope of the voluntary license is not limited to 100 countries like it is for the HIV medicine, but consider geographic diversity, in particular make sure that this can also respond to the reality of the burden of the COVID-19, in particular in Latin America and in Asia. So again, we have also experience working with FIND in terms of diagnostic, that we can actually support technology transfer and local production in Africa or in Latin America, and we are doing this. So again, first, we need to be more pushy, I think, because the situation we see currently is not acceptable. Recognize the specificity of the tool, and again, not just focus on IP issues, but really to have a more comprehensive way to deal with that. Consider local production and support local production. I think that there are initiatives that are on their way, recognizing that it will take time, but it's something that needs to be done now. And of course, all of this should be reflected in a future treaty. So thank you again for organizing this side event. I think it's quite important, and we will be really looking at all the discussion to make sure that we also can push in the right direction. Thank you, Hélène. Over to you.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you for reminding us, as Anban also did, that it is not only about vaccines, but that we also have to keep our eye on the therapeutics and the diagnostics. The therapeutics may not be, may still have to come, but we know that there is some in the pipeline, and to ensure that access is indeed assured globally would be very important. Also, your point that the solutions need to be global. We're in a global crisis. You can't have sort of partial solutions or partial licenses. Those would also have to address the global needs. So thank you for that. Your remarks on support for local production capacity is a very good introduction to the next speaker, Martin Friede, who has hands-on experience with actually making that happen. And I would like to invite Martin from the World Health Organization to give his remarks. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a really great panel. It's great to be here. But I'm going to begin with a little bit of a pessimistic statement, because one of the advantages of growing old is that you've been around for a while. And so let's look at what's happened in the past, and why do I feel somewhat pessimistic? Let's go back to 1976. There was a small influenza outbreak in Northern Americas. And at that time, Canada did not have vaccine production. The USA did. And although Canada put in orders to procure influenza vaccine, it did not get vaccine because the US was going to use them first in the USA. So this is the first really reported case we've got of vaccine nationalism, which we're now seeing once again today. It's déjà vu. Then this discussion we're having now reminds me very much of 2006, when there was an H5N1 scare. And many of the developing countries, especially from Asia, realized that they were having H5N1 cases, but did not have the capacity or the technology to produce influenza vaccines. And there was a lot of discussion at the Assembly about, can we get technology transfer for influenza vaccines? Now, at that time, we responded positively, the world responded positively, and there was a big activity that was done under the leadership of Mary Polkini, the then ADG, to drive technology transfer for influenza vaccines. And this was partially successful. We went from having zero pandemic capacity in developing countries to about 1 billion doses. But within this, there were also a lot of failures. And those failures were driven by the absence of a sustainable market. So when we then saw in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic, we once again saw it was those regions that did not have production capacity. They were the last in line to get the vaccines, just as we see now. And some of them only received the vaccines after the pandemic. 2014 came along, Ebola, West Africa. Similar thing. It was the places that needed it the most did not have the capacity. And now here we are, 2021. I really worry that we're going to finish the same way that we've done the previous ones. We talk and then nothing happens. So what do we need to do? We need to be building national, regional, and global resilience. But to get to this resilience, we're going to have to establish sustainable regional production. Now, how do we get sustainable regional production? First of all, sustainable is critical. And this is where our influenza project sometimes fell down. Because if a facility is not producing something that it is selling on a day-to-day basis, it will not be maintained. We are seeing facilities being closed down because the government says we don't need influenza vaccines, or we can buy the influenza vaccines on the international market cheaper than we can make them ourselves. So the first thing we need to do is to work out how to make things sustainable. And the second is that this has to be regional. So for influenza, most of the facilities that were being built for the national scale. Now, this is not going to work if every country builds a facility just for themselves. We need to have facilities that are big enough to serve the region, which means that at that size, the cost of goods is going to be competitive on the international market. But this also means that there has to be something in place to ensure that in the event of a pandemic, these producing countries will export to their neighbors. And this is where what we're looking at currently suggests that this is not a very easy thing to do. So what many of you, I hope, know is that about a month ago, WHO issued a call for expression of interest to establish a technology transfer center to make mRNA vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines, for COVID, but also for other vaccines. Now, the good news is there's been a lot of interest in this technology transfer, and there have been many groups that have come forward, academic groups, biotechnology company groups that have come forward and said, we would like to contribute to this technology transfer hub. So they are prepared to provide their know-how to the hub, and then from the hub, this know-how can be transferred to other manufacturers around the world. We have two objectives here. The first is to increase the capabilities of those existing manufacturers in low and middle income countries, but very importantly, to build new manufacturing capacity in those regions where currently there is none. And this clearly we need to point here to the Afro region, where there's very little capacity, to the EMRO region, very little capacity, but also parts of PAHO, parts of CIRO, and even parts of WIPRO have got are very underserved in capacity. But when we do this, this needs to be done in such a way that it is sustainable and in a way that it serves the region. Now, the Technology Transfer Hub provides the know-how. This is the objective of a Technology Transfer Hub. The know-how is usually a voluntary sharing, and we've seen, fortunately, that for mRNA, there are willing donors to share their technology. Now, the question is, will IP be a problem? For the moment, for the vaccines that we are looking at, we think that IP today is not a problem in the low and middle income countries. But this does not mean that IP will not be a problem tomorrow. But what we do need to also bear in mind is that doing technology transfer, it's one thing to have somebody who says, I'm prepared to give my know-how. You need to have groups that are ready to receive the know-how and capable of receiving the know-how with the infrastructure to receive the know-how. This means they need to be trained and with the necessary capacities. So, Ellen, to come to the question that you asked me, how will a treaty facilitate technology transfer and establishing of manufacturing? I would say that this will work if the treaty supports sustainable markets between pandemics as well as during pandemics. It needs to ensure that national production will serve all the region and that we don't get vaccine nationalism. But also a treaty will need to maintain ready technology recipients, because we do not know that the technology today will be ready, will be suitable for the next pandemic. But what we will need to do is to maintain armies of technically competent groups in all of the regions that would be ready to receive the technology, because we can do all the treaties we want, but if there's nobody able to receive it, that will not serve any purpose. I stop there and back to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this very useful overview. And I share with you the feeling of getting older and seeing things come by several times over. I would like to say, I hope you're not old enough to retire, because I think WHO and the world at large is going to need you in the time to come. Some very good suggestions also for the treaty, particularly the element of making sure that if technology transfer indeed happens, production capacity is developed, that it is maintained over time. That also would mean allowing those technologies to be used for various purposes in times when pandemics are not striking the globe. Thank you very much for those remarks. We have heard from our main speakers. We're now going to open the floor to our 5 respondents. They should be joining the panel now, or perhaps they already have. If so, then I would like to invite Luis Villarroel from Chile, who's heading the organization Innovarte, to offer his remarks. Luis, are you?
Yes, I am here, and maybe you might even see me. Okay,
I do see you. Hello, Luis. Welcome.
Okay, so but I look nicer in the picture. Well, thank you very much to the organizer for this great event. As has been said, there are many issues that are needed to solve to find the right solution to a pandemic. But I'm an IP lawyer, so I will just focus on IP. I somehow a little bit disagree on the aspect that the IP today is not a problem. We have seen a number of cases where there are needs and there are also a possible provider of the service that have not been able to participate because of IP barriers, including with not only IP, but also with trade secrets. We have the example of the case of Roche with the test kits for PCRs, and now we have the issue of BioLysis in Canada being able to produce some vaccines, and there is a need and a request for countries, and still they cannot start producing because of the IP. And the thing is that the IP was never meant to be a barrier to life. And the problem is that the flexibilities that are available in the treaties have not been implemented. So I think that what has to be addressed in the treaty is has to include obligations with regard to implement the IP flexibilities that are currently available, but they are not being implemented. And also with regard to IP, it's very important to remember that it's not only about TRIPS, but IP is in other treaties that also should be addressed. And not only you will have treaties of intellectual property, putting a barrier to access and know-how and data and genetic resources, but are all also other treaties like investment treaties. So my proposal will be to have in the future a pandemic treaty to have a non-enforcement obligation, not only with regard to IP provisions of all IP treaties, but also to other treaties like the investment treaty that might create a barrier to access. There are some other, elemental obligations for states to be included, like the linking of the funding and investment of research and innovation to obligations to share the knowledge. That is something that is not today standard in all countries. I will say the less countries have that type of obligation. Also, we think that it will be very useful to have some type of automatic clauses that will, change exclusive right to only to fair compensation rights to facilitate, the transfer of knowledge. And finally, I would like to highlight the need to put some enforcement provision within the pandemic treaty to make possible that individuals and private parties, not only states, to have a recourse in case of a state is not in compliance with the pandemic treaty. And I see a very good model in the treaties that provide protection for investment that allows, individuals to sue the states in a special court. So I think that to take a look on these investment treaties with regard to the possibility of having action against those countries that are not in compliance will be very good. Also, there are other enforcement mechanisms that we think we should take a look, but my time is over, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Luis, for these comments and some very good remarks, in particular on the element of the automatic triggering of certain measures. I very much hope you'll be you continue to be engaged in the drafting and in the formulating ideas for new international agreements on these matters. The next speaker I would like to invite is James Love from Knowledge Ecology International. Jamie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. I'm not seeing you, but I'm hearing you, so I'm giving you the floor. Over to you, Jamie.
Oh, okay. All right.
I see you now. Welcome.
Well, can others hear me? Can anyone hear me?
I think it's okay.
I just want to make sure that the sound is working, because when Luis spoke, I didn't hear him at first. Are you able to hear me right now? Okay, fine. Thank you.
The sound is fine.
I'm gonna walk through 5 points as quickly as I can. The treaty can enable more robust global rights to inventions, data, and know-how for countermeasures. This should, at a minimum, go to the provisions in funding agreements from governments. The 2020 COVID-19 R&D funding contracts involve billions of dollars in direct funding and subsidies for R&D and advanced purchase agreements that de-risk the development of vaccines, therapeutics, and other technologies such as diagnostic tests. Governments have retained some, often limited rights, but in not all the contracts. A better, more coordinated approach would have seen more robust rights that could have been used to make technologies global public goods, enabling the scaling of more decentralized production and lower prices. Number 2, buyouts of know-how. Governments could commit in advance to create a fund to buy the rights in inventions, data, know-how, and access to biological resources that governments or UN agencies do not control, but which would be more useful in a pandemic if available as a global public good. This is a cost-effective, but so far underutilized intervention to address the need to scale manufacturing. Such buyouts could work best with collaboration among countries on paying for the buyouts. 3, funding R&D. Higher income countries could commit to make minimum contributions to fund R&D with robust global rights to ensure future that we can address future health challenges. Discussions about creating soft or hard norms for minimum funding of priority have taken place in the WHO over the past 2 decades. This can be an opportunity to take a first step. 4, CTAP could become PTAP or just TAP. And you can reboot and transform CTAP, which is now the COVID Technology Access Pool, into the Pandemic Technology Access Pool, or I think better, just the Technology Access Pool, to create a forward-looking pool for rights and inventions, data, know-how, and biological resources, not just for COVID-19, but for any future global emergency. And my last point is on transparency. The treaty should address the public interest in transparency. This was mentioned by the speaker from South Africa. Transparency of R&D contracts, patent landscapes, licenses, prices, trial outcomes, manufacturing cost, efficacy of a diagnostic test, the cost of clinical trials, and the role of government in funding and subsidizing clinical trials, and the existing and potential manufacturing capacity for different technologies. I think that transparency is something that has really been one of the major policy failures of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for this very, very good few bullets, and you even stayed under 3 minutes, which is a great achievement considering how much content you managed to offer us in such a short period of time. The next person I would like to invite is Jaume Fridal from Health Action International. Jaume, you have the floor.
Thank you. The existence of common agreed rules, together with a set of shared values, represents the backbone of any human community. Rules and values help us to organize an existence where conflict and hardships are unavoidable, a reality where cooperation and joint efforts work always better than pure self-interest, or should rather be the case. Health Action International celebrated 40 years of history and activism yesterday. We remembered feats, changes, and transformations that our organization has witnessed and, in occasions, pushed and advocated for in the domain of access to medicines. We also ask ourselves what has changed in the legal, institutional, and political landscape where we operate. Human ingenuity and, again, cooperation and selfness has brought us achievements all of us should feel proud, from raising immunization rates to breaking the back of the AIDS pandemic or taking up the challenges of neglected diseases. We were, however, pained to see how governance on health issues at the global level has evolved in the last 4 decades, how the World Health Organization has allowed for private actors to gain visibility and influence in relevant policy discussions, how governments have stood aside while the ability of civil society in WHO proceedings have been limited and our voice stifled, and how finally the so-called global health governance structure, made up mostly by Western-based institutions, was ill-equipped to respond to challenges in the global south, from H1N1 in South Asia, Ebola in Central Africa, to cholera in Haiti. And COVID arrived, breaking a buck in our lives and societies. The initial hefty words of vaccines as global public goods were replaced by hoarding doses by wealthier countries. International solidarity lost out to vaccine apartheid. The proposal for a TRIPS waiver submitted by South Africa and India is not only a call to put health needs above IP protection rules, but the expression of a deeper malaise in many parts of the world in the losing end of a corporate-driven globalization pioneered by pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies which were able to deliver us vaccines in less than a year, a truly impressive record, and an astounding achievement which sadly is only benefiting a tiny portion of the world population. The opposition of wealthier countries to the South African and Indian proposal without offering any alternative beyond donation or charity shall not be forgotten. Neither should the refusal in very explicit terms of pharmaceutical companies to engage in WHO COVID-19 Technologies Access Pool CTAP, a pandemic treaty as a response to global health challenges encompassing in technology transfer, IP management, and supply chain matters, offers hope for an end to the pandemic that is not the prelude to another one. WHO should engage fully in coordinating and supporting the drafting process, making sure that public interest civil society is not only present, but also allowed to speak and be heard. And yes, we have seen this before. when proposals were made from civil society during the e-week negotiations to draft an international convention on biomedical innovation and R&D, and were quashed by philanthropic institutions and wealthy countries, the very same that today doubt and oppose the TRIPS waiver proposal. We need a pandemic treaty to, after this tragedy, get back through cooperation and joint efforts to our sense of community with a shared set of rules and values. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you for reminding us that partially we've indeed been here before in the negotiations of the Intergovernmental Working Group on Intellectual Property, Public Health and Innovation, and the proposals for the R&D convention that that were made in that process, but indeed were watered down to something that no one recognizes anymore as a useful tool. So let's not repeat that this time around. The involvement of civil society organizations and others would be very important in this process indeed, which is a very good moment to introduce Anna Marriott. She's the head of policy of Oxfam and has been the face and voice of the People's Vaccine Alliance. Anna, you have the floor. Before you start, may I ask everyone to mute your microphones? Thank you. Anna, that has now happened. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and for those kind words. But I should say that the People's Vaccine Alliance is a movement of so many organizations and individuals, and it's an incredibly powerful movement to be part of. And I guess I should start my comments by saying that my head is really in two places on the pandemic treaty. There's a part of me that instinctively feels that the treaty negotiations are a distraction from the actions that governments should be taking but are not taking right now to solve the vaccine apartheid, to get behind the removal of intellectual property barriers and insist that the technology and know-how is shared, ramp up that manufacturing capacity as urgently as possible to ensure that everybody has access to the tools to protect lives. And then there's another part of me who thinks that we're in the midst of the result of a colossal failure of multilateralism, a failure that has been driven by rich countries that had the most power and resource to do things differently, and they failed to do so. And that political attention to this huge failure will sadly wane, and that politicians will be able to turn away from those calls that we should never again be in this situation, as they have done many times before, as Martin so eloquently described. So perhaps there is no better time to establish the new norms and the new rules that are clearly so urgently needed whilst we are in the midst of this chaotic and very distressing situation. And for me, the points I want to make about what priority should be in a pandemic treaty have is really an echo of some of the points that have been made already. First and foremost, the absolute critical need to establish new norms of behavior and cooperation than those that have delivered the vaccine apartheid that we see before us. And I would suggest three priorities. We must have binding commitments to financing the R&D for the health tools needed to save lives. The vaccines, yes, but also the therapeutics, the diagnostics, and the other technologies. And this should be based on a risk-sharing model with contributions according to ability to pay and benefits according to need. I think everybody needs to contribute, whether that be $1 or $1 billion. I think everyone needs to be part, every nation needs to be part of that funding family and benefit from that funding fairly. That there are secondly, clear and unequivocal conditions on that funding, that the results it produces, the science, the know-how, are actually global public goods. free of intellectual property, and that the know-how and the technology funded by people, us, the taxpayers, is owned by the people. It must never be the private property of any single entity, any single company. It should belong to the people. And that norm of sharing has to become embedded and agreed within any treaty. My third priority, and it's been mentioned by others, is that need for the long-term sustainable funding commitment to invest and maintain manufacturing facilities and the continuous transfer of technology so that the world has the capacity available and the ability to protect everyone on the planet as quickly and as comprehensively as possible. And again, as others have said, that this manufacturing has to be distributed geographically with priority attention to building capacity in the global south under government stewardship, not the commercial vested interests of a handful of very powerful and profitable pharmaceutical corporations. So that's my top three. We should never again have to say never again, but here we are saying it again. My priority is on the urgent actions needed right now by our governments to take back control from those pharmaceutical corporations and remove the barriers to scaling up vaccine production. But let's also learn right now from these disastrous errors and the disastrous model that we have that continues to deny access to millions of people around the world. Let's learn from that now and develop those new norms going forward. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you, Anna, for these very, very good points, and in a way, perhaps, and you may not even be aware of that, but you sort of outlined the basic principles of the R&D treaty that was discussed a decade or so ago at the WHO. There are a lot of good ideas out there, or a lot of good ideas that, as someone said the other day, could be dusted off and finally being implemented. I also hear this theme of the need to create greater production capacity, but also mechanisms to sustain that capacity over time. So the sustainability of that will be very, very important. And of course, the sharing of the know-how, if we couple that with a very strong call and advocacy for the funding of the research and development, that should really provide an opening to do things differently and to indeed arrive at a system for the development and the production and the provision of global public goods. We have a few minutes left for questions and answers, and we have already received a number of questions in the chat. I am not the world's greatest multitasker, but I'll try to pull a few out, and I'll ask those of you who are still on the panel to help answer some of these questions. But the several of the attendants have raised the issue that the pharmaceutical companies are saying that if you waive IP, it will increase the competition for raw ingredients required and thus hamper the efforts to scale up. And this person is seeking a response to that. How difficult is it actually to expand the production? And perhaps Jamie could comment on that, because it is coupled with the remarks that it would take time. You can't really scale up at the moment. How true is that, and how long would it actually take to establish manufacturing capacity, including in areas where it does not exist today? Jamie, could you comment on that?
Well, I think it would be, yeah, thank you. It would be helpful if there was just more openness and transparency about what facilities are out there that have some capacity to do manufacturing. We have done our own survey that a lot of people have looked at, but we feel it's not really good enough. There are, each vaccine platform or therapeutic has a different set of requirements in terms of manufacturing. So some of it has to be a bit nuanced. There are facilities which right now can manufacture without any changes. They're ready to go. And then there are other facilities that would require some modifications and some changes in addition to whatever knowledge transfers is required. Martin described about the ability to receive the technology transfer is also kind of a barrier. But if we looked at the agreements that have been done so far, the average has been about 6 months from the beginning of an outsourcing of agreement or a retrofitting agreement to where production has actually happened. There's some of the scaling that's gone on has happened faster than 6 months. Some of it's taken longer than 6 months, but 6 months is kind of an average. And it's not too surprising because if you look at the beginning of the pandemic, there wasn't any vaccine, there weren't any therapies, there was basically nothing. And then in a relatively short amount of time, you had people manufacturing brand new vaccines. You had people in clinical trials, thousands of people in clinical trials. And by the end of the year, you had submissions to the FDA. I think that we've asked the WHO to do a call on manufacturing capacity and to have it be a public transparent call. I think CEPI right now is doing a confidential survey, but we think there should be more transparency of where the three things, like what facilities are out there and what would it take in terms of time, money, and know-how to get those facilities online. But we know that there's a significant number of companies that have tried to get voluntary licenses. They've tried to get technology transfers that have been turned back. Even big companies like Teva have not been able to find a partner to manufacture vaccines.
Thank you, Jamie. That also speaks to the point that a lot of time is lost. I often hear people say it is too late. If we start doing this now, it won't really deliver on time. But of course, we should remind ourselves that a year ago, this proposition was made to share the intellectual property, and we've lost that year. It's not a reason to not play catch up, but certainly lost a lot of time.
Could I just mention, just on the timing thing, if you think the pandemic will be over by Christmas, it's probably too late. But if you think this pandemic is going to go on for a while, and people are talking about, oh, you need a booster, an annual thing, a third dose, maybe need to combine the AstraZeneca with the Pfizer vaccine. We don't really know how many years the pandemic is going to go on, how many doses or how robust or what kind of combinations you're going to need. So I think the more you look down the road, the more it's not too late.
Indeed, and I was just listening to the Global Health Summit where a number of pharma CEOs spoke, and they talked about delivering vaccines to low and middle income countries in 2022. So they clearly don't have an accelerated schedule in mind. There is a question in the chat about the framework treaty. The person says, do we really need a framework treaty? We have the international health regulations. Isn't that enough? I don't know who to, perhaps Philippe or Winnie, you could both respond to that. Winnie, would you like to offer a response to the statement that the international health regulations should be able to do the job? I think you have to unmute, Winnie.
Is this the question, was why do we need a framework convention?
Yes, and why this cannot be done through the international health regulations?
Okay. I am not an expert on the international health regulations, but we did see the limits of what WHO could do in the case of a health emergency that emerged in one country and that slowly grew into a global pandemic because it didn't even spread so rapidly. We saw it come to Europe and devastate Italy and a few countries. Then we saw it spread to the United States, down to developing countries, and it's still growing. But the WHO had limitations on what it could do to study, to know its source and to curb it before it could spread to a global pandemic. So we need rules around that. Then we, of course, have rules that are written in other global rules, like the trade rules, which prevent us, which actually allow companies to be the ones to decide on how the world can respond to stop a pandemic. That's not acceptable. This is the role of governments, protect the lives of their people. But if this power has been given away through the trade rules, so there's a need to claw back that and put in place some rules that allow putting aside any trade rules, any financial rules, any rules in order to save lives. So we need, I hope I'm answering your question, we need a treaty that is going to allow the world and the governments of the world to take, as Anna said, take back control and be the ones to protect lives and deliver on the right to health for everybody.
Thank you, Winnie. And of course, the predictability of measures is incredibly important. I very much have the feeling that we're sort of designing all kinds of mechanisms and responses in the middle of a health crisis while things should have been in place.
Exactly.
And you need mechanisms that automatically trigger responses. Philippe, did you want to come in on this particular issue? And if so, then I will give you the last word before I wrap up, because we're beginning to run out of time. Philippe, if you want to speak, you need to unmute your microphone. Perhaps Philippe is no longer with us on the panel. In that case, I'm going to give myself the final word.
Before you do, can I have mine?
Winnie, you can have a final word too. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ellen, for indulging me. I just want to say, this is a global crisis, totally unprecedented in the magnitude of this crisis. Well, maybe there have been others before, but huge crisis. And as always, women rise in times of crisis. Women rise. Today, two global leaders have put a report out on how to save the world from a future crisis of this kind. Prime Minister Helen Clark, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf have put out a proposal that we all must back if we are to avoid being back where we were at the next crisis. Women have risen. I'm so proud, and I want to say, let's back this report and push it into implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. You've brought us full circle, because, as you know, we started this session with an opening presentation by Prime Minister Helen Clark, which was very inspiring, and indeed should lead all of us to read the report that the panel has put out recently. That report will also be presented to the World Health Assembly next week, and has an enormous amount of material that could feed into designing better solutions and designing better mechanisms and better multilateral approaches across the agencies, because it isn't just a matter of the WHO or just a matter of the WTO, but various agencies will have to come together, and we need solutions. We need urgent solutions for the situation, but we definitely need to design an effective response when a pandemic comes around the second time. The next time. Let's hope it won't be soon. My final task is to thank all the panelists and the respondents. I would also like to thank the participants who have not been visible but have been here in in large numbers, many of them delegates to the World Health Assembly. We hope that this meeting has been useful for you. And I also, again, want to express my wish to hopefully next year meet you in person when the 75th World Health Assembly meets. Let's also hope that we then can talk and assess significant progress made. I wish you a very good World Health Assembly next week, and thank everyone for having made this this seminar possible, and particularly the absolute wonderful team of Health Action International. Thank you, and I wish you a very good afternoon and a very good weekend.
Thank you.